In 1942, the Pacific sky belonged to Japan. From the coral lagoons of the Marshall Islands to the burning wrecks at Pearl Harbor, a single silhouette ruled the heavens. Long wings, round canopy, rising sun on the tail. The Mitsubishi A6M-0. To its pilots, it was more than a machine. It was a promise. To its enemies, it was a ghost. Agile, weightless, almost supernatural in its grace, the Zero could outturn anything the Allies sent against it. Dogfights that began as duels ended as disappearances. The sky would flash, twist, and then silence. When the wreckage fell, it was always Allied. In the dark rooms of carrier-ready rooms and jungle airfields, whispers spread like superstition. Nothing can turn with a Zero. It became both warning and prophecy. Veteran squadrons that had once ruled the air over Europe were erased within weeks. The Pacific was a different war, one fought not in numbers, but in seconds, where the man who could pull tighter, climb faster, live longer, decided the fate of fleets. Yet myths, like machines, are built from choices. The Zero's perfection came at a cost unseen from the ground. It was built light, too light. Its frame was aluminum stripped of armor, its fuel tanks were unsealed, its wings sacrificed strength for lift. Every ounce of metal removed gave it agility, and every ounce lost brought it closer to death. The same machine that danced so elegantly could not take a single hit. When the first wreckage of a Zero was recovered on Akutan Island in mid-1942, American engineers gathered around it in stunned silence. They saw beauty and fragility. Its genius lay in subtraction, not protection. To defeat it, America would have to do the opposite. It would have to build not a dancer, but a survivor. In workshops hidden behind the factories of Long Island and Connecticut, designers began sketching a different kind of predator, one that could bleed and still fly, that could climb when others fell. The world had seen what elegance could do. Now it was time to see what endurance could become. Across the cold hangars of Long Island, the sound of hammers echoed like a vow. Inside the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, men and women worked under the watch of a quiet, methodical leader. Leroy Grumman. He was not a poet of machines, but their philosopher. Where others saw elegance, he saw endurance. His belief was simple. If the sky punished weakness, then strength must be built, not imagined. The Navy had come to him with desperation in its voice. American pilots were dying faster than new ones could be trained. The Japanese Zero ruled the Pacific, and the small, rugged F-4F Wildcat, America's current carrier fighter, was being outflown and outclimbed in every encounter. The Navy's demand was uncompromising. Build us a fighter that can dominate from a carrier deck and return home full of holes. A plane that can take a punch, give one back, and still find its way to the sea. Grumman gathered his engineers around a single question. What if the answer wasn't agility, but endurance? What if America could build a fighter so strong, so forgiving, that even a wounded pilot could bring it home? That question became a sketch, then a structure, then a doctrine. It would be called the F6F, the Hellcat. At first glance, it seemed to grow from the old Wildcat, the faithful but outmatched brawler of Midway. But this was no simple evolution. It was, as one engineer said, the Wildcat on steroids. The fuselage swelled in size. The wings grew broader, stronger. Its undercarriage could withstand the brutal impact of carrier landings. While its cockpit was wrapped in armor the Zero would never dare to carry. Beneath its broad nose sat the beating heart of the design. A Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower of relentless purpose. It didn't whisper through the sky like a Zero. It thundered through it. Every bolt, every rivet carried a single message. The days of delicate fighters were over. Grumman's team understood that beauty in war was measured not by lines or curves, but by how much punishment a machine could absorb and still fly. The Zero, for all its grace, could never recover from a single hit. The Hellcat was built to take 5 and keep going, while Japan trusted instinct, the artistry of the lone designer, the intuition of the pilot. America trusted iteration. Mistakes were dissected, reworked, improved. Factories became laboratories of adaptation. Grumman's engineers tested, broke, and rebuilt until every weakness was accounted for. They didn't seek perfection, they engineered inevitability. When the prototype was rolled out in 1942, it looked plain, almost ordinary. No one would have called it beautiful. Its proportions were thick, its weight immense, its frame unromantic. But within that unremarkable shape lay a truth that would soon rewrite the Pacific War. A plane that didn't rely on myth, only on method. The Japanese Zero had been designed for the perfect dogfight. The Hellcat was built for every other kind of fight. The ones that went wrong, the ones where survival mattered more than symmetry. It was the product of a culture that believed victory was not born of genius, but of endurance refined through repetition. As the first engines roared to life, workers paused in the factory bays to listen. The sound was different, deeper, heavier, certain. It was not the sound of grace, it was the sound of consequence. Soon, this machine would rise from carrier decks across the Pacific, built not to dance, but to dominate. And when it met the Zero in the sky, the war that had begun in myth would be decided by mathematics. June 26, 1942. The airfield at Bethpage, Long Island, shimmered in the early summer heat. Mechanics stood beside a shape that seemed too large, too blunt, too heavy to fly, the prototype of the Grumman F-6F. Its wings, thick and angular, stretched across the tarmac like the shoulders of a prizefighter. The men called it the Hellcat, though few yet believed the name would mean anything beyond that day's test. At the center of the crowd, test pilot Robert L. Hall climbed into the cockpit. The canopy closed with a metallic click, and the silence before ignition hung like ceremony. Then came the roar, deep, guttural, defiant. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine came alive, shaking the ground. Dust rose from the airfield. For the first time, America's answer to the Zero pulled forward into history. On takeoff, it felt heavy, stubborn, a creature born of armor and muscle, not elegance. The first few hundred feet were tense, but then Hall opened the throttle. The double Wasp responded like a living thing, dragging the aircraft skyward with astonishing force. The weight melted away. The Hellcat climbed with the smooth, inevitable pull of a rising tide. From the ground, engineers watched in silence as the dark silhouette rose higher and higher, the sound of its engine fading into the clouds. "She flies like a rock until you open the throttle," Hall said, after landing. The men laughed, but they understood. It was not a compliment. It was a revelation. This machine was not meant to dance. It was meant to dominate. In the following weeks, the prototype was pushed to its limits. Barrel rolls, dives, vertical climbs. Each maneuver revealed something new. The Hellcat's wide wings gave it stability. Its reinforced frame endured abuse that would have torn earlier fighters apart. It was not nimble in the way of a Zero, but it did not need to be. It was steady, predictable, strong. It could absorb mistakes, and in war, that meant lives saved. The Navy watched closely. Reports from the Pacific were grim. Pilots in outdated Wildcats were dying in duels they could not win. The service could not afford another fragile machine. What they needed was reliability, something that could take a hit, land on a carrier deck, and fly again the next day. The Hellcat was that machine. Before testing even finished, the Navy made its decision. Full-scale production began. It was a gamble, but one grounded in faith, not desperation. America had chosen to fight not with elegance, but with endurance. Across the ocean, Japanese intelligence took note of the new aircraft. Reports described it as a large metal fighter, slower and heavier than the Zero. Analysts dismissed it. American metal monsters cannot fight, they wrote. They are too heavy, too clumsy. To them, the laws of air combat were unshakable. Agility defeats armor, grace defeats power. But those laws were already being rewritten, in the wind tunnels of Long Island, in the roaring test flights that split the summer sky. The Hellcat did not obey the traditions of dogfighting. It created new ones. As production lines expanded and engines rolled out by the thousands, a quiet certainty settled over the Grumman factory floors. The age of fragile fighters was ending. In its place was something industrial, relentless, a weapon built not for beauty, but for belief. The Japanese would soon learn that in war, the heaviest machine is not always the slowest, and the loudest engine often carries the calmest purpose. Over the Pacific, the metal monster they had mocked was already on its way. By early 1943, the Pacific War had changed its rhythm. The chaos of Midway was behind, but victory still felt distant. The ocean stretched endless and indifferent, a blue mirror that hid both promise and death. From the decks of America's new Essex-class carriers, a new sound began to rise, the deep, confident thunder of the Hellcats' engines. For the first time, the U.S. Navy had a fighter built not for desperation, but for dominance. The pilots who received them were survivors, men who had flown the fragile F-4F Wildcat, who had watched comrades vanish into the sea under the guns of the Zero. Now they stood beside something different, heavier, broader, slower to the eye, yet filled with potential. It was not beautiful, it was not agile, but it felt safe. For pilots who had lived through months of impossible odds, that meant everything. The transition was not graceful. Carrier decks became classrooms, and mistakes were measured in wreckage. The Hellcat handled differently from the Wildcat, stronger on the climb, slower on the turn. Its power could throw a careless pilot into a spin. "She flies like a tank until you open the throttle," one instructor said. The men learned quickly that the Hellcat demanded trust. Treat it like a wildcat, and it would punish you. Fly it as it was built to be flown, and it would protect you. By August, the first Hellcats roared off carrier decks toward Marcus Island. They met the enemy above clouds heavy with Pacific humidity. The Zeros appeared suddenly, dropping from the sun, graceful, familiar predators. The old instincts kicked in. American pilots turned hard, trying to match the dance. The result was disaster. In a horizontal fight, the Zero still ruled. 2 Hellcats fell before the others understood their mistake. But those who survived adapted. They remembered the briefings, the engine tests, the engineers' warnings. Do not turn with him. Climb. One pilot broke away and pulled his Hellcat skyward, the double Wasp engine screaming in defiance. A Zero followed, but its lighter frame betrayed it. Power faded, climb rate dropped, and within seconds, the American was above him. The Hellcat rolled, dove, and fired. The legend of the Zero met its first fracture in that moment, not from a stronger machine, but from a smarter one. The early duels were brutal lessons written in flame and salt spray. For every victory, a mistake. For every mistake, a funeral. Yet slowly the balance began to shift. The Hellcat's armor saved men who would have died in Wildcats. Bullet holes pocked the fuselage. Engines sputtered. Wings smoked. But the planes returned. Pilots landed shaking, sweat-soaked, alive. The Zero had always fought like a blade. Clean, quick, precise. The Hellcat fought like a hammer. Patient, inevitable, unstoppable. At Tarawa, the Navy saw the new pattern form. The Americans climbed, struck from above, and refused to follow the Zero into its spirals. The war in the air was no longer about grace. It was about endurance. Who could climb higher, dive faster, absorb more, and return again tomorrow? The Hellcat's thick frame and raw power began to turn each engagement into a war of attrition that Japan could not afford. By the end of 1943, the men who had once feared the Zero now spoke of it with the calm of experience. They had learned that victory was not about matching your enemy, but forcing him to fight your kind of war. The era of turning duels was ending. The sky was learning a new geometry, one drawn not in circles, but in lines that went ever upward. And at the top of those lines, waiting with steel and certainty, was the Hellcat. The Pacific sky is a cruel teacher. It rewards those who adapt and buries those who don't. By the middle of 1943, American pilots had survived enough battles to understand what the manuals hadn't yet caught up to. The Hellcat was not the Wildcat reborn. It was something else entirely, a creature of altitude and endurance, born to climb rather than turn. In the first months of combat, those who tried to fight the Zero on its terms vanished in spirals of smoke. But then, slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Pilots noticed that when they pulled the Hellcat into a steep ascent, the Japanese fighter hesitated. Its engine screamed, its climb faltered, and it dropped away helplessly. At full throttle, the Hellcat could climb at more than 3,000 feet per minute. The Zero could not match even 2/3 of that. In a war fought above the clouds, that difference was destiny. Flight instructors back at Pearl Harbor began to rewrite the training guides. The old warning, "Never turn with a Zero," was joined by a new commandment. Go up. Every pilot learned it by heart. Dogfighting was no longer a matter of circles and reflexes. It became a contest of geometry and energy, of who could store altitude, trade it for speed, and then regain it before the other could respond. The Hellcat had entered a new kind of war, one where physics itself became weapon. The change was profound. Instructors called it vertical fighting. Hellcats would climb high, dive fast, strike once, and then climb again, vanishing into the sky before the enemy could recover. It was a rhythm, not a brawl. The air war became music played in altitude, and the Hellcat held the higher note. To master this rhythm took nerve. It required patience to hold the climb, discipline to resist the temptation of a turning fight, and absolute trust in the machine. "The Zero can twist," one veteran told a trainee, "but it can't breathe up there." At 20,000 feet, the tables turned. The Zero's light frame and low-powered Sakai engine gasped in the thin air. Its agility, once its greatest gift, became its weakness. The Hellcat, heavy but unyielding, thrived where the Zero suffocated. Pilots spoke of the feeling, the pull of gravity as the aircraft surged upward, the deep thrum of the double Wasp engine at full throttle, the steady climb that felt less like flight and more like ascension. They learned to time their dives, to strike with precision and retreat with speed. Each engagement became a lesson in patience and control. By late 1943, the results were undeniable. Engagement reports from Marcus Island and the Marshalls read like a reversal of fortune. The same Japanese squadrons that once hunted now found themselves hunted from above. American pilots would dive from the sun, fire a short burst, and disappear. The Zero pilots tried to follow, but their aircraft stalled, engines wheezing in protest. For the first time, the hunters knew fear. The shift was not just tactical, it was philosophical. The Hellcat had proven that brute power could outthink agility, that in the long game of endurance, patience could kill faster than elegance. What began as survival had evolved into supremacy. One Hellcat pilot described it best. The Zero was a knife fighter. We brought a hammer. In the endless skies above the Pacific, the hammer now swung without hesitation. Japan's myth of air superiority, built on grace and instinct, had met an enemy that could outclimb, outlast, and outfight it. And as the Hellcats rose higher into the thin blue air, the legend of the Zero began to fall, not in flames, but in silence. The hunter had become the hunted. By 1943, the war in the Pacific was not only being fought in the air, it was being forged in metal, sweat, and time. On Long Island, 30 miles from New York City, a factory never slept. Beneath the hum of fluorescent light and the rhythm of riveting guns, thousands of men and women worked without pause. The sign above the entrance read, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, but the workers had another name for it, the Iron Works. Inside, industry had become ritual. Conveyor belts carried fuselages like offerings. Riveters lined the wings with the precision of surgeons. Women in blue overalls fastened bolts beside veterans too old to fight, but too proud to stop. The air smelled of oil and ambition. Each day, a new Hellcat rolled off the line, identical to the one before it and the one after. Perfection had ceased to be an ideal. It had become a process. In a war once ruled by individual skill, the lone ace, the dueling dogfight, America had discovered a new form of power, replication. The Hellcat was not merely built, it was produced with mathematical certainty across 24-hour shifts that blurred day into night. Its wings were interchangeable, its engines standardized, its parts could be replaced by any hand, on any carrier, in any ocean. The Hellcat was not a fighter plane anymore. It was a system. Across the Pacific, Japan could not match it. Every Zero that fell from the sky took months to replace, and the men who had flown them, years to train. Their replacements were young, half-prepared, sent to meet enemies who now flew machines built by thousands, not one. The air war's balance was tilting, not by miracle or strategy, but by method. Grumman's assembly lines became the hidden front of the Pacific. Each rivet, each test flight, each engine run-up was another step toward victory. The Hellcat's power came not only from its 2,000 horsepower engine, but from the civilization that could produce 1,000 more like it. Where Japan worshipped mastery, America perfected repetition. It was a quiet revolution. Engineers and factory workers became soldiers in their own right, fighting not with rifles but with precision. The language of war was changing, from courage to calculation, from instinct to industry. The Zero had been born of craftsmanship. The Hellcat was born of coordination. In that difference lay the outcome of the Pacific War. By late 1943, the carriers of the U.S. Navy had become floating extensions of Grumman's factory floor. Spare parts arrived in crates stamped with the same serial numbers, the same tools that had built the original aircraft. Pilots no longer flew fragile prototypes. They flew components of a vast mechanical organism, replaceable, reliable, relentless. When a Hellcat fell, another was already being assembled. When one pilot died, another took his seat in an identical cockpit. Continuity had become the new courage. Japan's factories, shattered by bombing and starved of materials, could no longer keep pace. Each new Zero emerged as an artifact, not a weapon. It carried the ghosts of 1,000 pilots lost, and the weight of a nation that could not build fast enough to grieve. In America, the Iron Works continued to roar. Its machines did not rest, its workers did not falter. The Hellcat was no longer just an aircraft of war, It was an emblem of industrial faith, proof that victory could be engineered by those who refused to stop building. And as those machines crossed the Pacific by the hundreds, their wings folded neatly on the decks of the Essex-class carriers, the sky itself began to change hands. The War of Heroes was ending. The War of Systems had begun. June 19th, 1944. The sun rose over the Philippine Sea as it had for centuries, quiet, endless, indifferent. But beneath it, history was assembling. The U.S. Fifth Fleet stretched across the horizon, a city of steel drifting on blue water, 15 carriers, 7 battleships, more than 900 aircraft, the largest armada humanity had ever built. To the east, Japan's mobile fleet advanced from the Marianas, its decks stacked with the remnants of an air arm that had once ruled the Pacific. For years, the rising sun had commanded the skies with speed and skill. Now, with its veterans gone and its factories silent, it sent forth the last of its strength. Nearly 400 planes rose from the decks of Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiho, a desperate strike meant to halt the American tide. On the American flagship USS Lexington, radar screens began to flicker. Operators leaned forward, voices calm but urgent. Many bogies inbound. The alarm passed from ship to ship, from carrier decks to pilots strapped into waiting cockpits. Engines roared awake. The sound rolled across the fleet like thunder. Within minutes, the Hellcats were airborne, dark silhouettes lifting from the decks in perfect sequence. They climbed steadily, engines howling as they formed a vast web of blue-gray fighters over the sea. For the men who flew them, there was no panic, no rush. They trusted their machines, their training, and the endless hours of drills that had turned chaos into choreography. The Hellcat squadrons climbed not as individuals, but as a system, methodical, disciplined, precise. At 10,000 feet, the first contacts appeared, distant dots against the sun, approaching fast. The Japanese came on in waves, Vals, Judys, and Zeeks, carrying bombs, torpedoes, and the memory of former glory. But the war they had trained for no longer existed. When the first Hellcats opened fire, the sky changed color. Tracer rounds arced through the blue like falling comets. Bombers burned before they could release. Fighters spun into the sea, trailing black smoke. Over the radios, calm voices marked each victory. Splash 1, Splash 2. The coordination was surgical, not emotional. The Hellcat pilots were not chasing glory. They were performing a task. The Japanese formations disintegrated within minutes. Pilots who had once danced through duels now found themselves outclimbed, outgunned, and overwhelmed. The Hellcat's speed and altitude advantage made it untouchable. Its 2,000 horsepower engine turned vertical climbs into escapes, dives into executions. The Zero's agility, once its sacred gift, had become irrelevant in a war now ruled by power and precision. By mid-morning, the sea below was littered with oil and debris. Radio intercepts told the rest. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft lost, their carriers left defenseless. On the decks of the Fifth Fleet, the numbers seemed unreal. 300 enemy planes destroyed for the loss of only 29 Hellcats. One pilot, watching burning wrecks spiral into the waves, keyed his microphone and spoke softly. It's like swatting flies. The phrase would travel through history, not as mockery, but as measure. The Pacific War had reached its turning point. The empire that began the conflict with mastery of the air was ending it in silence. For the Japanese commanders, the shock was total. The pilots they had sent forward, many barely trained, never returned. The carriers that had once carried their triumphs now carried only fuel and ghosts. Within days, 3 of Japan's largest carriers were sunk, their names erased by torpedoes and fire. The rising sun still flew, but its shadow no longer reached the sea. Above the wreckage, the Hellcats returned to their carriers in disciplined lines. Their pilots were young, many barely 20, but their professionalism had transformed war itself. This was no duel of aces, it was industrial combat, mass, precision, and method turned into motion. The machine had replaced the myth. As the last fighters touched down and their engines wound to silence, the ocean below still burned. The battle was over. The Pacific was no longer contested. And somewhere beyond the smoke, Japan's surviving admirals stared into the same horizon they had once conquered, now empty, now lost, and understood that the age of the Zero had ended. The era of the Hellcat had begun. In the summer of 1944, news of the Battle of the Philippine Sea reached Tokyo like a cold wind. At first, disbelief, then silence. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft had been lost, most without inflicting a single serious blow. The reports were too devastating to accept. Veteran squadrons, men who had trained for years, who had fought since Pearl Harbor, were gone. The carriers that had carried their dreams now drifted home empty. For Japan, the loss was more than material. It was spiritual. The nation that had once ruled the skies of the Pacific now faced a void where its pride had been. The airmen who returned spoke of an enemy that should not have existed, an American fighter faster in the climb, deadlier in the dive, and nearly indestructible in combat. They had seen the Hellcat up close, and it had defied everything they believed about aerial warfare. Their commanders dismissed it as exaggeration. They claimed poor tactics, bad weather, bad luck. But as the raids began again, over the Marianas, over Formosa, over the home islands, the truth revealed itself. The Hellcats returned again and again, descending from altitudes the Zeros could no longer reach. Every encounter ended the same way, the Zero twisting helplessly below, the American pulling upward into the sun. For years, Japan's faith in the Zero had bordered on religion. It was the embodiment of the samurai ideal, light, graceful, and pure. To question its perfection was heresy, but now the heresy had become history. The Zero's thin skin and unarmored frame, once symbols of efficiency, had become its coffin. Its 940 horsepower Sakai engine, magnificent in 1940, was powerless against the Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower double Wasp. What had once been speed was now fragility. In Tokyo's aircraft bureaus, engineers worked through the night, desperate to reclaim what was lost. They built heavier versions of the Zero, adding armor and self-sealing tanks. But each new bolt of protection stole the very gift that had made the plane legendary, its agility. The fighter that once danced across the sky now stumbled. One engineer would later say, "We tried to save the Zero by making it what it was never meant to be." Meanwhile, Japan's training schools stood nearly empty. Its best instructors had been lost in the Marianas. New pilots, barely 20 hours in the cockpit, were rushed to the front. Their takeoffs were uncertain, their landings worse. They faced enemies who now fought as an organized machine, radar-guided, well-armed, and mercilessly efficient. The once proud duels of the Pacific had turned into one-sided executions. Across the Pacific, Hellcat pilots noticed the change. Their enemies no longer climbed to meet them. They attacked from below, desperate, disorganized. "The sky used to belong to them," one American pilot said. "Now it feels empty." For Japan, that emptiness was unbearable. The empire that had once spread by air, from China to the Solomons, from the Philippines to Pearl Harbor, could no longer protect its own islands. Airfields grew quiet, fuel reserves dwindled, and young men were told to prepare for missions from which they would not return. The myth of the samurai sky, of courage defeating machinery, of spirit overcoming steel, was collapsing under the weight of physics and production. No amount of bravery could outclimb horsepower. No tradition could outlast industry. By late 1944, Japan's skies had turned from theater to refuge. The empire that once ruled the air now hid beneath it, watching as American formations passed overhead like storms, unchallenged, unstoppable, unending. The Zero, once the symbol of dominance, had become a relic of memory. And in that silence, Japan's commanders finally understood the truth their pilots had seen first. The age of legend had ended. The age of machinery had begun. By the autumn of 1944, the sky over the Pacific no longer belonged to men. It belonged to machines. Across every carrier deck of the U.S. Navy, rows of blue-gray aircraft gleamed in the morning sun. Grumman Hellcats, wings folded, engines silent, waiting. They were not the fragile fighters of 1942. They were the embodiment of America's new kind of warfare, methodical, industrial, and absolute. When the engines came alive, their roar rolled across the water like thunder. The sound meant control. Above Formosa, the Philippines, Okinawa, wherever the carriers sailed, the Hellcat now ruled. The air war that had begun as chaos had become orchestration. Fighter groups launched in perfect rhythm, guided by radar, trained by doctrine, supported by factories half a world away. Each pilot knew his place in the vast design. The results were staggering. In just 2 years, the Hellcat had achieved what no other fighter in history ever had. Dominance so complete that even numbers lost meaning. By late 1944, U.S. Papa. Navy kill ratios averaged 19-1 in favor of the Hellcat. 19 Japanese aircraft downed for every one lost. In some squadrons, the margin was even higher. The statistics read like fiction, but they were written in logbooks, signed by men who had seen the sky turn from duel to harvest. The Zero still appeared, fragile, courageous, obsolete. Its pilots, often barely trained, charged headlong into battle with the faith of those who knew their odds. Against them, the Hellcat was merciless. Its 650 caliber guns could shred an aircraft in a single burst. Its armor absorbed punishment that would have torn a Zero apart. "It flies home half dead," one mechanic said with pride. And it did, engines coughing, wings scarred, but alive. On the carriers, maintenance crews treated their machines with reverence. The Hellcat's simplicity was its genius. Panels could be replaced in minutes, engines swapped between sorties. What Japan had crafted as art, America had built as system. The Hellcat did not need beauty. It needed reliability. And reliability, multiplied by thousands, had become power. Above the Pacific, that power was now visible. Entire Hellcat squadrons swept ahead of bomber formations like armored shields, clearing the skies before the enemy even arrived. For Japanese pilots, the sight of them, dozens of dark shapes climbing into the sunlight, was enough to end hope before the fight began. Radio intercepts from Japanese fleets began referring to the Hellcat by a new name, the Blue-Gray Death. It was not meant as insult, but recognition. The machine's color, dull and practical, mirrored its nature, steady, unstoppable, without vanity. Where the Zero had symbolized grace, the Hellcat represented inevitability. From the decks of the Essex-class carriers, pilots looked down on islands once thought unreachable. Truk, Formosa, Manila Bay. Every day brought new missions, and every mission carried the same outcome. The enemy rarely appeared in force anymore. The skies that had once swarmed with Japanese fighters now stood empty. In that emptiness, a strange silence began to settle. Pilots who had survived the early years of the war spoke quietly of it. of the loneliness that came with victory. They remembered the first months of fear, the duels that had cost friends and fuel and faith. Now the duels were gone. The Hellcat had made them impossible. For centuries, the warrior's dream had been to meet his equal in open combat. Skill against skill, courage against courage. But by 1944, the age of equals had ended. The machine had erased it. Battles were no longer won by reflex or chance, but by production, coordination, and method. The sky, once sacred, now belonged to steel. From the horizon to the clouds, the Pacific had become a vast, mechanical empire. Each wave, each deck, each aircraft a note in a single, overwhelming symphony. The Hellcat had not only conquered the zero, it had conquered the idea of the lone hero. And somewhere in the quiet between missions, as engines cooled and the ocean stretched infinite beneath them, the men who flew it began to understand the truth their enemy had already learned. The age of the pilot was ending. The age of the system had begun. October 1944, the skies over the Philippines burned again. Below, the largest naval invasion in history unfolded across Leyte Gulf, where the U.S. Navy sought to reclaim the islands that had been lost at the war's beginning. Above that armada, the Hellcat stood as guardian, sleek, powerful, undefeated. But this time, what approached them from the east was something new, something for which no manual, no doctrine, and no engine could prepare them. The first reports were confused. Pilots spoke of enemy aircraft diving straight into ships, ignoring defensive fire, refusing to pull away. Then came confirmation. Japan had turned desperation into doctrine. The Tokotai, the special attack units, had been born. Kamikaze, divine wind. The term carried echoes of medieval salvation, but to those who saw it firsthand, it was a storm made of men. Hellcat squadrons met the attacks head-on. They rose from the carriers like walls of motion, climbing through smoke and fire. Every second became a race, to intercept before impact, to destroy before death could find the fleet. Pilots who had once fought in the measured rhythm of dogfights now faced chaos. There was no maneuver, no strategy, only collision. They shot down hundreds. The kill ratios remained astronomical, the Hellcat as lethal as ever. But the sense of triumph was gone. For every enemy destroyed, another followed, already falling in flames toward a ship, a deck, a crew. American gunners watched with helpless clarity as aircraft, burning, broken, mortally hit, still completed their dives. The same power that had made the Hellcat supreme could not stop the will of those who no longer feared dying. For the first time in the war, the sky became a mirror. The Americans saw not just an enemy, but a reflection of what war had become, a machine of total devotion, consuming pilot and plane alike. The men in the Hellcats had built their confidence on endurance, on the belief that mastery of engineering could replace sacrifice, but the kamikaze blurred that boundary. These were pilots stripped of tactics, of survival instinct, of everything but purpose. After the battles over Leyte, flight decks filled with the damaged survivors. Hellcats returning home scorched, wings torn by debris, pilots pale and silent. They had won, as always, but the victory no longer felt like triumph. It felt like endurance. One pilot wrote home, "We shot them down by the dozen, but the sky didn't clear. It just filled with ghosts." In those weeks, the Hellcat's perfection became both its strength and its burden. It had no equal, no defeat, no weakness to humble it. And yet, in facing an enemy that chose death over defeat, perfection offered no comfort. Each success carried a question. If technology had brought mastery of the sky, what had it taken from the soul? The kamikaze offensive cost Japan dearly. Thousands of planes, thousands of pilots, hundreds of ships lost. but its moral weight lingered longer than its tactical effect. The Hellcat had proved that industrial strength could conquer the world, but it could not redeem it. In the cockpit, surrounded by instruments of precision, American pilots began to sense the edge of a truth they would carry for the rest of their lives. By the end of 1944, the Hellcat remained undefeated. No Japanese fighter had bested it in air-to-air combat. But it was no longer fighting for superiority, it was fighting against despair. In every burning horizon, in every dive intercepted too late, victory revealed its cost. The age of the duel was over. The age of annihilation had begun, and as the sun set over the shattered waters of Leyte, even the masters of the sky understood. The enemy had fallen, but something human had fallen with them. By late 1944, the Hellcat had done more than win dogfights. It had proven a doctrine. War was no longer about the brilliance of a few, but the precision of the many. America had built not just a fighter, but a philosophy. Build it simple, make it strong, send it by the thousands. At Grumman's Long Island factory, that philosophy lived in motion. Miles of conveyor belts rolled beneath the glare of sodium lamps. Sparks cascaded from welding torches like metallic rain. Every worker, from the draftsmen in suits to the women riveters with scarves tied over their hair, understood the same purpose: keep the line moving. Each bolt tightened was another victory, measured not in theory, but in steel. The Hellcat's heart, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, came from the same blueprint as the Corsairs and the Thunderbolts. Its bolts, screws, and instruments were shared across multiple airframes. It meant that every part could be built anywhere and replaced everywhere. The Navy's carriers became self-contained factories at sea, supplied by a nation that had learned the art of infinite duplication. Japan could not match it. Its industry remained scattered. Small workshops, limited materials, skilled hands stretched thin. Where America's factories built thousands, Japan's built dozens. The Zero had been born from craftsmanship, the Hellcat from coordination. And in a world consumed by total war, coordination would always outlast craftsmanship. For the first time, the battlefield had been reduced to a problem of logistics. The side that could replace faster, repair faster, build faster, would survive. In that equation, America held every advantage. Engineers became silent generals. Their front lines were drafting tables, their weapons, blueprints, and lathes. They fought with mathematics, precision, and efficiency. The Navy's carrier groups, now armed entirely with Hellcats, moved through the Pacific like factories on water. Planes returned from battle, damaged and scorched, only to be rebuilt in hours. Mechanics swapped engines by routine, fitted wings like puzzle pieces. No other nation in history had waged war with such mechanical confidence. At Grumman, they called it engineering at war. It was the triumph of process over improvisation, of systems over struggle. Every plane was a promise, not just to the pilot who flew it, but to the next one who would replace him. In that repetition lay a quiet kind of immortality. The Hellcat itself was never exotic. It was blocky, heavy, and almost plain, but its simplicity was its strength. It could take hits that would tear lighter aircraft apart. It could be built in 1/10 the time of a Zero, and when it fell, another would rise in its place before the enemy could reload. Historians would later call it the most successful naval fighter in history, but its success was not measured in speed or design elegance. It was measured in the power of production, in the ability to turn knowledge into endurance. The Hellcat was not an accident of genius. It was the deliberate outcome of engineering supremacy. For Japan, each loss was permanent. For America, Each loss was temporary. In that simple truth, the Pacific Air War was decided. The Hellcats engineers never wore medals, never flew in combat, and never saw the Pacific horizon. But they shaped it. Every drawing approved, every blueprint finalized, every test completed was another unseen victory. Their triumph was quiet, but total. By 1945, the sky over the Pacific was no longer the domain of pilots. It was the domain of those who had built the machines beneath them. The air war had become what one historian would later call a production line with wings. The era of the ace was over. The age of the engineer had begun. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had entered a strange silence. Across Japan's once feared island bases, airfields lay abandoned, their runways cracked, their hangars empty. The great duels of the sky, the whirling dances between Hellcat and Zero, had ended without ceremony. There was simply no one left to rise and meet them. Fuel was gone. Factories were rubble. Pilots, once trained for years, now sent to battle after weeks, had been consumed in the final, futile waves of the war. What had begun in 1941 as a nation of aviators, confident, ascendant, certain, had become a nation grounded. Even the air, once the Empire's proudest frontier, had turned against them. Hellcats now flew alone, crossing skies that no longer fought back. They patrolled over ghostly landscapes, shattered ports, burning forests, fleets without movement. Missions that once carried risk had become ritual. Pilots took off, circled, returned, and logged hours into logbooks that no longer measured victory. The mechanical hum that had once meant survival now echoed through emptiness. In those final months, the Hellcat became both conqueror and survivor. It was a machine built to endure, and endure it did. Long after the war, it was meant to fight had burned itself out. On its wings still clung the soot of countless raids, the ghosts of dogfights that had defined an era. Its 6 guns remained clean, ready, untouched. Yet the sky it once ruled now belonged to silence. Pilots who had entered the war as boys returned as men, undefeated but uneasy. Many spoke softly of the last flights. They remembered climbing into cockpits where they knew no enemy would appear. Some even left ammunition behind, knowing it would not be needed. "There's no one left to fight," one pilot said. His words carried no pride, only the still weight of finality. From above, the world looked smaller. The Pacific, once endless, now stretched like a calm sea beneath wings built for violence. The Hellcat, born from urgency and forged in repetition, had outlasted its purpose. It was a weapon without a war, a reminder that perfection, once achieved, has nowhere left to go. On the ground, Japan's few remaining aircraft rested like relics. The Zero, the plane that had once symbolized supremacy, now sat in rows, stripped for parts. Its skin faded and its legacy spent. The empire that had dreamed of eternal victory now stared into an eternal horizon, its myth undone by mathematics and metal. For the men who flew the Hellcat, triumph was tempered by reflection. They had fought an enemy of extraordinary courage and defeated it through extraordinary means. But victory brought no jubilation, only a quiet understanding of what had been lost on both sides. The war had not been won by passion, but by process, not by heroes, but by systems. In the months that followed, the last Hellcats continued their patrols, tracing paths over seas that no longer bled. The air war had been mastered, and in that mastery, it had vanished. The machine that once defied death had outlived it. The pilots who had once chased glory now chased silence. And high above the Pacific, where clouds once carried the roar of engines and the echo of battle cries, only the wind remained, whispering through the wings of a fighter that had survived everything except the need for itself. War, at last, had moved beyond courage. The final duel was not against an enemy, but against memory itself. When the war ended, the engines went silent. On the decks of carriers that had once launched the storms of the Pacific, the Hellcats sat in neat rows, paint blistered, wings folded, eyes of glass staring out over calm water. The fighter that had ruled the sky did not end in flame or glory. It ended in stillness. Within months, the world it had conquered began to vanish. Jet engines screamed across test fields in California and England, their power promising a new era of speed that the Hellcats' propeller could never reach. The aircraft that had once seemed unstoppable now belonged to the past, a relic of pistons, rivets, and faith in steel. Yet even as technology moved on, history paused to remember what it had achieved. Historians would call it the most successful naval fighter in history. In just 2 years of combat, it had destroyed more than 5,000 enemy aircraft, a record that would never be surpassed. Its kill ratio, 19-1, became the mathematical proof of American air supremacy. But numbers tell only part of the truth. What made the Hellcat immortal was not the statistics, it was the principle behind them. The Hellcat was not a miracle. It was a machine of logic, built by engineers who trusted process over instinct. It proved that perfection in war could come not from brilliance, but from understanding. In its simplicity lay its genius, a fighter any man could fly, any crew could repair, any factory could build. It was the weapon of a nation that had turned industry into an art. Across the Pacific, Japan faced a different future. Its factories lay in ruins, its fleet sunk, its once mighty air arms silenced. Yet from the ashes came renewal, not through conquest, but through creation. The nation that had once built the Zero turned its craftsmanship toward peace. Within a generation, Japan's engineers would help lead the world in aviation again, not as warriors, but as innovators. In the decades that followed, the men who had once fought each other met again. Former Hellcat pilots and Zero veterans gathered at air shows, museums, and memorials. Time had stripped away the uniforms, but not the memories. They spoke not of hatred, but of respect, of battles where skill met courage, and where machines became mirrors of the men who flew them. One Japanese ace reportedly shook hands with his former American counterpart and said, "In those days, we believed our planes could not be beaten, but belief changes slower than truth." The American smiled, and the truth, he said, was built in Long Island. That exchange captured what history would come to understand. Technology changes faster than belief. The Zero had been built for an age of spirit. The Hellcat belonged to an age of systems. The war between them had not just reshaped the Pacific, it had rewritten the relationship between humanity and its machines. By the time the last Hellcat was retired from service, its story had already passed into legend. In museums, it sits beneath quiet lights, its dark blue paint faded to gray, its propeller still. Children look at it and see victory. Engineers look and see precision. Pilots look and remember what it felt like to climb into something that could outlast fear itself. The world moved on, into jets, into missiles, into an era where speed was measured not in miles, but in sound. Yet the Hellcat remains, a silent monument to a truth that outlived the war. Victory was not imagined in the sky. It was engineered on the ground. And in that engineering, calm, relentless, and exact, the modern age was born. History often remembers war as a contest of power, of explosions, numbers, and fire. But the Pacific taught another truth, that victory is not only seized in moments of fury, but sustained in years of endurance. In the beginning, Japan's Zero had embodied the dreamer's philosophy. It was light, agile, elegant, a machine of instinct born from faith in the pilot's touch. It proved that skill could defy size and precision could outmaneuver power. For 2 years, it ruled the air by grace alone. Its legend was not mechanical, it was almost spiritual, but in time, every dream meets the weight of reality. When the Hellcat arrived, it brought with it a new idea, that in war, survival is not just an outcome, but a weapon. The Hellcat was not the faster turner, nor the more graceful flyer, it was the one that stayed. When its wings were torn, it returned. When its engine was scarred, it flew again. The Zero taught the world how to fight beautifully. The Hellcat taught it how to win completely. In the laboratories and factories of America, engineers had built something more than an aircraft. They had built a philosophy of patience, a belief that the war would not be decided by brilliance in the moment, but by endurance over time. Where Japan trusted instinct, America trusted iteration. Every flaw was studied, corrected, and rebuilt. The Hellcat was not born perfect. It was made perfect by persistence. This contrast between agility and endurance, between the dreamer and the builder, would define not only the Pacific, but the century that followed. The dreamers burn brightly and vanish. The builders work quietly and remain. It was a hard truth, earned through fire, loss, and time. The Pacific War, viewed from history's distance, was not simply a battle of nations. It was a dialogue between philosophies, between the art of flight and the science of survival. The Zero soared on courage. The Hellcat climbed on calculation. And in that difference lay the future of warfare. When the smoke cleared, one truth endured. Resilience lasts longer than brilliance. The Zero's grace had inspired the world, but the Hellcat's strength had reshaped it. The lesson was not that speed or elegance had failed, only that no machine, however beautiful, could escape the slow certainty of method. Even now, decades later, engineers and historians return to that contrast between what is imagined and what is sustained. The Zero was the dream of an empire. The Hellcat was the discipline of a democracy. One faded with the men who flew it. The other became a template for generations. In every war that followed, in Korea, in Vietnam, in the skies of modern combat, the principle held, endurance is strategy. Machines that can survive, adapt, and return define the future far more than those that dazzle and disappear. The Pacific did not just forge a new kind of aircraft, it forged a new kind of understanding that patience, multiplied by power, becomes destiny. The Zero had once ruled by passion, the Hellcat endured by persistence, and when the dust of war finally settled over the endless blue of the Pacific, it left behind a single quiet truth. Dreams begin wars, but patience measured in metal, ends them. In 1942, the sky belonged to the Japanese Zero. Its pilots believed, with reason, that no enemy could match their grace, their discipline, or their machine. From the Philippines to the Coral Sea, they had proven it. When reports arrived that America was building new fighters, heavy, clumsy, thick with armor, the reaction was not fear, it was laughter. To the veterans of the Rising Sun, the idea seemed absurd. A fighter built like a tank, a plane that turned slower, climbed heavier, and relied on brute force instead of balance. The Japanese aces had spent years mastering the dance of the dogfight, the art of motion without waste. They trusted instinct, not instruments, lightness, not logic. To them, the American answer was not evolution. It was ignorance. But wars do not obey pride, and machines do not obey myth. 2 years later, Over the Marianas, that laughter would die beneath the roar of 2,000 horsepower engines. By 1944, the Hellcat had transformed from a prototype into a prophecy. The same planes that once seemed absurd now climbed higher, faster, and longer than anything Japan could send to meet them. The Zeros that rose to challenge them never returned. The Air War's old laws, that agility beats armor, that lightness conquers mass, had been broken. At first, disbelief replaced arrogance. Japanese pilots reported duels where their enemies not only survived impossible hits, but countered from above with overwhelming speed. Their own turns, once decisive, became death traps. The Americans no longer fight horizontally, one surviving pilot wrote. They rise, always rise. What had begun as a contest of men had become a contest of methods, between those who trusted spirit and those who trusted structure. The Hellcat was not just a fighter, it was the sum of an entire nation's discipline, its factories, its engineers, its supply chains. Each bolt, each bearing, each engine was a note in an industrial symphony conducted across oceans. The pilots who flew them understood this. They carried with them not only courage, but calculation, the belief that victory could be built, tested, and refined. In every climb, they carried the invisible weight of those who forged their machines. The Hellcat's wings were made not only of aluminum and rivets, but of intention. The Japanese, once masters of aerial artistry, found themselves fighting a mirror that reflected not their weakness, but their past strength, their faith in perfection, their refusal to adapt. As the skies filled with the thunder of Hellcats, the Zero's legend faded like a story told in a language the war no longer spoke. The silence that followed was not defeat alone. It was realization. The world had entered a new era, one in which power was measured not by daring, but by design. The Hellcat's dominance was not romantic, it was relentless. It did not soar by instinct, but by engineering. The future, it seemed, would belong not to those who fought beautifully, but to those who built efficiently. When the war ended, the laughter that had greeted America's flying tanks was gone. In its place stood a quiet respect, and something deeper, a recognition that the battlefield had changed forever. The Hellcat had rewritten the sky's commandments. Light no longer beat heavy. Speed no longer beat strength. For the first time, victory in the air depended not on how a machine moved, but on how it was made. Each Hellcat that flew over the Pacific carried more than fuel and ammunition. It carried belief, in repetition, in refinement, in the power of patience. Behind every flight were the thousands who built it, the millions who supplied it, and the idea that progress could be as decisive as courage. The Zero had been a legend of flight. The Hellcat became a lesson in history. The war in the air ended not in myth, but in mechanics, and across the vast Pacific, where the echoes of engines once filled the horizon, that lesson remains, as quiet and as final as the ending of a laugh. They laughed once, they never laughed again.